Some mysteries unfold not in alleyways or moors, but within the very heart of Baker Street. Tonight's tale begins with a gathering of 12 guests, each summoned by an unseen hand, each carrying secrets darker than the London fog. What follows is no dinner party, but a tribunal of guilt, deceit, and vengeance. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The hour has struck, the circle is drawn. Let us step into the judgment that awaits. It was a raw, cheerless evening in early November when Sherlock Holmes startled me by proposing a gathering at Baker Street. My companion, as a rule, detested company. The sanctuary of our rooms was rarely invaded, save by a client with a case of sufficient gravity to engage his powers. Yet, on this occasion, Holmes himself had summoned me early from my rounds, with the curt assurance that I would witness a spectacle in deduction unlike any that had previously unfolded beneath our roof. He spoke little over supper, though I caught him glancing toward the clock as though it ticked away the prelude to some secret drama. There was an unmistakable intensity in his gaze, a tightening of those hawk-like features, and a restlessness in the fingers that tapped the arm of his chair. "I do not entertain for pleasure, Watson," he said at last, his voice grave. "But tonight Baker Street must become a theatre of judgment. Watch closely. The play has already begun." I felt a peculiar chill at his words. What could draw a dozen strangers to our modest rooms, and why did Holmes, whose every instinct was for privacy, invite such intrusion? There was an air about him that evening that made me think of a conductor poised before some dark symphony, waiting only for the first instrument to sound. Holmes did not leave me long in suspense. From the mantel he took a letter, the paper thick, the handwriting angular and firm. Without ceremony, he placed it in my hand. "You will observe, Watson," said he, "the instructions are explicit. A gathering of 12, each summoned under the pretext of knowing something of a crime, one which has not yet occurred." I read the letter with growing unease. The writer, who remained nameless, declared himself a benefactor of justice. He claimed to have identified 12 individuals in possession of knowledge, some fragmentary, some damning, regarding a crime about to stain London. It was his desire that they be assembled before Holmes, whose judgment he trusted above that of the magistrates. The suggestion was absurd, and yet here, in Holmes's hand, lay the proof. "You cannot be serious," I protested. "Surely this is a madman's jest." Holmes only smiled faintly, his eyes glittering. "Mad, Watson? Perhaps. Yet the postmark is genuine, the handwriting consistent with a man of education, and the seal. Ah, the seal belongs to a club of exceedingly private character. No, my friend, the jest, if it be one, is elaborate. I mean to see it through." I could not repress a shudder. 12 guests, each bearing knowledge of an unknown crime, converging upon our quiet sitting room. It was a notion so grotesque that even my years with Holmes had not prepared me for it. Still, I trusted him implicitly. If he declared it vital, I would remain by his side, though the very air seemed to grow colder at the thought. The fog lay thick over London that night, wreathing the street lamps in halos of sickly yellow. One by one, the guests arrived at our door, their footsteps muffled in the damp mist. I observed them closely as Holmes bade me, each cloaked in secrecy, each bearing the mark of unease. The first was a lady in widow's black, her veil drawn low, who refused to give her name. She was followed by a stout merchant, whose heavy watch chain glittered like ill-gotten treasure across his waistcoat. Next came a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers, whose eyes darted about the room as though fearful of pursuit. So they entered, until our humble sitting room groaned beneath the weight of strangers. There was a disgraced officer, whose bearing betrayed discipline long soured into bitterness, a smooth-tongued fellow with the manner of a card sharper, 2 who exchanged furtive glances that bespoke intimacy they dared not confess. Each, in their own way, carried shadows of guilt, fear, or secrecy. I felt as though our rooms had been transformed into some infernal courtroom. Holmes stood among them like a presiding judge, silent, motionless, save for those keen eyes that missed no tremor of hand nor flicker of lip. And yet, as the final arrival removed his dripping coat and laid it upon the rack, an odd sensation seized me. I counted the garments, 12 in number. But when I looked back upon the chairs where our guests sat, there were only 11. I blinked, counted again, my heart quickening. 11 figures sat in tense silence. 12 coats hung by the door. Somewhere among us was a phantom guest. Never before had I seen Baker Street so transformed. The very walls seemed to shrink beneath the pressure of so many presences, each heavy with unspoken secrets. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that leapt across the faces of the assembled company. Their eyes glittered in the half-light, shifting restlessly from one another to Holmes, who stood by the mantel like a silent sentinel. There was no ease, no air of sociability such as one might expect at an ordinary gathering. Each man and woman sat rigid, their posture betraying unease, their hands either clenched upon their knees or fiddling nervously with watch chains, gloves, or lockets. A murmur of voices rose now and again, broken fragments of whispers that died quickly, as though the speakers feared the sound of their own words. Holmes alone remained calm, detached, almost statuesque. He neither spoke nor invited conversation, but watched. Oh, how he watched! His eyes, sharp and penetrating, roved from one guest to another, noting, weighing, and, I was certain, already drawing inferences that escaped the rest of us entirely. I confess, I felt smothered by the atmosphere. The room, so familiar to me, had become something alien, a tribunal chamber, a cage, perhaps even a snare. The smoke of a dozen pipes and cigars hung thick in the air, mingling with the fog that crept in each time the door opened. It was as though we were adrift in a sea of grey vapour, with only Holmes's presence to anchor us against the tide of uncertainty. At last, a merchant of prosperous appearance broke the silence, speaking in tones too hearty to be natural. His words fell flat, and the widow in black silenced him with a glance as sharp as a knife. Another attempted a jest about the oddity of such company assembled in a bachelor's lodgings, but his laughter cracked, thin and brittle, and drew no answering smile. It was then I began to notice undercurrents, rivalries, grudges, perhaps even long-buried enmities. A pair of gentlemen avoided one another's gaze with such studied determination that I suspected past dealings between them. Two others leaned closer, whispering too intently to be mere acquaintances. And still others shifted uneasily, as though each passing moment weighed upon their conscience. I caught scraps of half-truths, veiled allusions to debts, betrayals, and some nameless shame. To my medical ear, the tension manifested in nervous tics, a stammer, a sudden clearing of the throat, the tapping of restless fingers upon the chair's arm. Holmes, however, remained unmoved. With the faintest curl of his lip, he seemed to invite their discomfort, to let the silence press upon them until the cracks widened. I saw his hand twitch toward his violin, but he refrained. Even music, he must have judged, would have been too merciful a release. The air grew colder with each passing moment. It was not conversation, but a contest of wills, and the room itself seemed to pulse with hidden antagonisms. I could not shake the impression that we sat not as guests, but as witnesses awaiting some grim revelation. As the oppressive silence thickened, I turned my gaze once more about the company. 11 faces stared into the firelight or down at their restless hands. 11 voices had been heard in snatches of talk, however fractured. Yet 12 had been summoned. The thought pricked me with sudden alarm. I glanced toward the door, where the row of coats and cloaks still hung. 1, 2, 3, I counted them carefully. 12 in all, heavy with the damp of the London fog. But only 11 sat before me. My breath caught. I looked again, more intently this time. 11 bodies occupied the chairs. No more. I told myself I had miscounted before, that my mind was prey to the confusion of smoke and shadow. Yet each time I reckoned, the conclusion remained the same. One guest was absent. A chill swept through me. The widow's veil trembled as she shifted in her seat. The merchant dabbed his brow with a handkerchief. The disgraced officer sat stiffer than before, as though listening for something just beyond the reach of hearing. And Holmes? He had not moved, save for the faintest narrowing of his eyes. At last he spoke, his voice low and cutting through the thick air. "Watson," he said, without turning his head, "you perceive it too." My heart thudded. Perceive what? That 12 had entered this house, but only 11 remained in the room. That somewhere in the shadows of Baker Street, unseen and unheard, a phantom guest lingered among us. Holmes at last broke the silence that had pressed upon us like a suffocating weight. His voice was calm, measured, yet it cut through the smoky air with the authority of a magistrate opening court. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his piercing gaze sweeping the room, "you are summoned here not for idle conjecture, but because each of you bears knowledge, be it truth, half-truth, or lie, of a crime that looms before us. Concealment will avail you nothing. Evasion will betray you more swiftly than confession." The widow shifted in her chair, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. The merchant fidgeted with his chain. The officer's jaw tightened as if bracing against a blow. Holmes allowed the silence to stretch, each second magnifying the tension, before directing his attention to the nearest guest. His questions came like the probing of a surgeon's scalpel. Clean, incisive, merciless. Each inquiry pierced a layer of pretense, compelling his subjects to speak, though they wished otherwise. I could not fail to marvel at the spectacle. Holmes had turned our modest lodgings into a courtroom, himself the relentless judge and jury. Even the most seasoned deceiver faltered beneath his scrutiny, though few offered more than shadows in place of substance. Yet in those shadows, I saw Holmes's mind at work. His eyes flickered with each slip, each tremor, each contradiction. The performance had begun in earnest, and I felt we were but witnesses to an invisible drama only Holmes could perceive. The testimonies unfolded like a tapestry woven from deceit. A gentleman of scholarly bearing declared that he had seen letters exchanged between two of the company, yet when pressed, he could not produce them. A nervous clerk stammered of financial dealings gone awry, though the details slipped away like sand through his trembling fingers. What struck me most was not the words themselves, but the way in which they were delivered, halting, evasive, or with too much eagerness, as though rehearsal had preceded sincerity. Holmes stood unmoving, his hands clasped behind his back, yet I could sense the calculations passing in silence. When the widow insisted she had never before met any soul present, Holmes's brow lifted almost imperceptibly. When the merchant contradicted the officer on the date of a meeting, Holmes's fingers drummed lightly against the mantel. To most, such gestures would be meaningless, but to me, long acquainted with his methods, they were as signposts upon a hidden road. The atmosphere grew darker with every utterance. Voices rose, faltered, and broke, weaving a web of half-revealed truths and veiled threats. I began to feel as though we sat not in a room of flesh and blood, but in a theatre of phantoms, where every figure was but an actor cloaked in lies. At length, Holmes raised a hand, and the clamour ceased as if by spell. His eyes, sharp as steel, lingered on each face in turn. Though he spoke not a word, I knew he had already marked the guilty from the innocent, or at least, those who sought to hide more than they revealed. It was then that a whisper stirred the gathering, a suggestion so grotesque that I confess my own flesh crawled at its utterance. The missing 12th, someone murmured, was no man of flesh, but a phantom. A ghost summoned from beyond the grave to complete the circle. A nervous laugh escaped one corner, quickly stifled. The widow crossed herself with a trembling hand. Even the merchant's ruddy complexion blanched beneath the flickering lamplight. For an instant, the notion seized me with its horror. 12 coats, 11 guests. The arithmetic would not resolve. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living presence, and in the corners of the room the shadows deepened until they seemed almost to breathe. Could it be possible, I asked myself, that something otherworldly lingered among us? Holmes, however, dismissed the murmur with a cold, disdainful smile. "Superstition thrives where reason falters," he said sharply. "Ghosts leave no coats upon the rack, nor do they strike bargains in the City of London. We deal not with spectres, Watson, but with men, and men, I assure you, are capable of monstrosities far greater than any phantom." His words steadied me, though they did not ease the chill that crept along my spine. The company fell silent once more, but I could not escape the sensation that unseen eyes were upon us, watching, waiting, biding their time. And somewhere, whether in flesh or in shadow, the 12th guest remained. Holmes's interrogation, though measured, began to draw threads together that only he could see. He pressed the merchant about the hour of a meeting in the city. The man declared it had been on Tuesday past, yet scarcely had the words left his lips when the scholar corrected him. "It was Monday, I recall, for it rained." The contradiction seemed trivial to the company, but Holmes's eyes flashed with sudden interest. Next, he directed a question to the widow. She had earlier professed herself foreign-born, yet in a moment of agitation her speech slipped into the pure cadence of London, her accent too familiar to be feigned. Holmes let the inconsistency pass without comment, but I, knowing him as I did, perceived the significance he attached to it. Then came a letter produced by the clerk, meant to corroborate his tale of a financial entanglement. The handwriting trembled across the page, but Holmes's gaze lingered on the loops and strokes. His fingers brushed the paper for but a second before returning it to the clerk. Later, as he leaned toward me, he whispered, "The hand is disguised, Watson, but not well enough. It is the same as another I have observed in this room." I felt a cold shiver. Each word, each gesture, seemed now a mask concealing some deeper treachery. Where others saw confused testimony, Holmes discerned the faint but damning fractures in a facade of lies. As Holmes's questions tapered, a strange hush settled upon the gathering. The company, weary of subterfuge and alarmed by the detective's penetrating gaze, withdrew into silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel. I found myself listening with unnatural intensity, as though expecting to hear some hidden movement behind the walls, or the step of the phantom 12th guest returning from the shadows. Each man and woman sat stiff, their faces pale, their eyes darting to Holmes and then away, as though they feared to see judgment written plainly upon his features. The atmosphere grew unbearable, thick with dread. It was as if all present were suspended in some unnatural pause, waiting for calamity to strike. My own nerves thrummed like the string of a violin drawn too tight, and I envied Holmes his composure, though I noted the sharpness in his eyes as they swept the room once more. Never had Baker Street seemed so oppressive. Our familiar walls had become the boundaries of a prison, in which guilty and innocent alike sat bound by fear, unable to speak, unwilling to move. I felt that the very air would burst with the weight of secrets left unspoken. The silence was shattered by a cry so piercing that it seemed to tear through the smoke and shadows like a blade. One of the guests, a pale, nervous man with the look of a clerk, rose suddenly from his chair, his hand clawing at his throat. His eyes bulged with terror as he gasped for air, knocking over a glass that splintered upon the floor. For an instant, the room dissolved into pandemonium. The widow shrieked, the merchant stumbled back against the wall, and the officer leapt to his feet with an oath. I rushed forward, but Holmes's hand restrained me. "It is too late, Watson," he said grimly. The man convulsed once, twice, and fell lifeless at our feet. His lips were tinged with a bluish pallor, and the scent of something acrid seemed to linger about the spilled glass. "Poison," Holmes declared, his voice cutting through the cries of horror. "Administered under our very eyes." A dreadful hush followed. 11 guests remained alive, but none dared meet the other's gaze. Each pair of eyes carried the same question, unspoken but unmistakable. Who among us had struck this blow? And still, above the corpse, above the terror, loomed the shadow of the 12th, unseen, unheard, and more menacing than ever. The death of the clerk struck the assembly like a thunderclap. For a single dreadful moment, silence reigned, broken only by the faint hiss of the dying fire. Then, as though released from some spell, the guests erupted into clamour. The widow screamed, her cry rising shrill above the tumult. The merchant bellowed accusations at the officer, who in turn swore with such violence that 2 others shrank back in terror. A gentleman of bookish appearance shouted that the poison must have been slipped by the fraudster at his side. The accused sprang to his feet, face white with fury, and demanded satisfaction there and then. The sitting room, so long a sanctuary of calm thought, had become a madhouse. Coats were snatched from the rack, chairs overturned, voices rose in discordant chorus, until it seemed the walls themselves must collapse beneath the weight of fear. I confess I, too, was shaken to my core. The suddenness of the death, the horror of poison administered in the very heart of Baker Street, unnerved me more than I cared to admit. My instinct was to rush among them, to seize the arms of those nearest, to calm the storm by sheer force. But even as the chaos threatened to engulf us all, Holmes had not stirred from his post. He stood tall by the mantel, his face pale but composed, his eyes shining with that peculiar fire which came only when his mind had seized upon a problem of the most perilous import. "Silence!" The word cracked like a pistol shot. All movement ceased. Every voice fell into a trembling hush. Holmes had spoken. He stepped forward, his figure looming in the firelight, one hand raised not in supplication, but in command. His gaze swept the company, cold, pitiless, unflinching. One by one, their eyes faltered and dropped before him. "No one shall leave this room," he declared. "There has been murder committed under my very roof, and the hand that dealt it is still among us. To bolt for the door is to invite suspicion. To accuse wildly is to confess one's own desperation. You will remain seated, and you will answer when called upon." The sheer authority in his tone quelled them more swiftly than any magistrate's gavel. Even the officer, who moments before had shouted for a duel, sank back into his chair like a chastised schoolboy. Holmes knelt beside the lifeless form, his long fingers moving with a surgeon's delicacy. He lifted the broken glass from the floor, examined the lips of the corpse, and held a pocket lens to the bluish stains. "Poison, as I remarked," he said quietly, "but not in the food, nor in the air. It was delivered more cunningly, perhaps even by the very vessel that lies shattered here." The room exhaled a collective shudder, as though even the walls recoiled at the thought. Holmes rose, holding the jagged rim of the fallen glass delicately between thumb and forefinger. The residue clung to its surface, a faint powdery crust that caught the lamplight, like frost upon a window pane. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The traces are unmistakable. A crystalline deposit, soluble, bitter. A pinch dropped into the drink, and death was assured." I bent nearer, my medical instincts quickening. The odour was faint, acrid, metallic. I knew enough of toxicology to surmise its deadly nature, though I could not name it with certainty. The widow stammered, But who could have done such a thing? None of us, none." Her protest only deepened the suspicion that hung like a pall. Eyes darted from face to face. The merchant scowled, the fraudster sneered, and the officer's hand twitched toward his empty scabbard, as though still in the mess hall of some colonial outpost. Holmes laid the glass upon the table with care. The act was not committed in haste nor by chance. The poison was carried here, prepared beforehand. Consider what that implies: intent, forethought, and above all, knowledge of the opportunity. Only one among you saw fit to act upon it. A murmur rose, low and fearful, like the stirrings of wind before a storm. Each guest shrank inward, clutching their secrets closer, yet dreading that Holmes's eyes might pierce them. For myself, I could not rid my mind of the ghastly arithmetic. 11 living souls, 1 corpse, and somewhere, unseen, the 12th, whose very absence was as menacing as the hand that had struck. Holmes's inspection of the chamber did not linger upon the obvious. While the others still whispered in dread over the poisoned glass, his gaze swept the room with the precision of a hawk in flight. It was then that I saw him pause by the hearthrug. With a sudden movement, he stooped and drew forth a pocket watch from beneath the leg of a chair. He held it aloft, the chain dangling, its case scratched as though it had been trodden underfoot in the recent confusion. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Our deceased friend wore no such timepiece, and yet here it lies, concealed beneath a chair leg, as though placed there deliberately in the commotion." The officer stiffened, his eyes narrowing, while the merchant's ruddy face paled. Neither spoke, though both seemed unsettled by the sight of the watch. Holmes turned the object over in his hands. The initials engraved upon the back had been crudely filed away, but not beyond recognition. He gave no sign of what he discerned, only slipped the watch into his pocket with an enigmatic smile. I felt the room constrict about us. The discovery hinted at movements made in secrecy, at a hand-slipping evidence where none should have been. Who had dropped the watch in panic? Who had sought to hide it, or to cast suspicion upon another? Holmes did not answer aloud, but I saw in his eyes that he knew more than he cared to confess at that moment. The strain upon my nerves grew intolerable. Surrounded by fear, poisoned death, and the oppressive silence of guilty men, I found myself seized by a reckless impulse. The merchant, with his heavy breathing and shifting eyes, had drawn my suspicion from the outset. His fingers drummed incessantly against his knee. His gaze darted toward the corpse with barely concealed agitation. "Holmes!" I exclaimed, rising despite myself. "It is he, the merchant. Look at him. The evidence points his way." The company gasped. The merchant leapt to his feet, his face crimson with fury. "A lie, sir! An outrage!" he bellowed, his fists clenched. Before the quarrel could descend into violence, Holmes's hand shot up. His voice, calm yet cutting, silenced us both. "Sit down, Watson," he said with cold reproach. "Your zeal outruns your judgment. Suspicion is not proof, and in this room, a careless word may serve the murderer better than silence." Shame flooded me. I sank back, my pulse racing, my cheeks aflame. Yet even as I did so, I could not help but observe the faint flicker in Holmes's eye. He had marked the merchant's reaction, had weighed it as one more piece in the unseen balance of his deductions. The others watched in hushed terror. To them, my accusation had seemed plausible. To Holmes, it had been but a spark to illuminate the shadows, showing him more than words alone could tell. Holmes returned once more to the body. His long fingers moved with deft certainty, searching pockets, loosening the sleeve of the dead man's coat. At length, he drew forth a small slip of folded paper, half concealed in the lining. I leaned forward eagerly, hoping at last for clarity, but Holmes's eyes flickered across the writing, and his expression darkened. Without a word, he rose, crossed to the hearth, and held the paper to the flame. "Holmes!" I cried. "For heaven's sake, what are you doing?" The edges curled, blackened, and in a moment the fragment was consumed, reduced to drifting ash. A murmur of horror rippled through the company. "You destroyed it!" I exclaimed, scarcely believing my eyes. Holmes's gaze fixed upon me, piercing, unyielding. What I read was not for their eyes, nor even for yours, Watson. To reveal it prematurely would place the guilty at an advantage and the innocent at greater peril. Trust me when I tell you it served its purpose before the flame touched it. The widow whimpered, the officer muttered an oath, and the merchant sat rigid, his face pale and sweating. None dared ask further, for Holmes's tone brooked no question. Yet my mind was afire. What secret had been concealed in that note? Why must it be destroyed before it could bring light to the darkness? The silence pressed heavier than before, each guest now shrinking deeper into themselves, haunted not only by suspicion but by the knowledge that Holmes possessed truths withheld from us all. As the ashes scattered into the grate, I felt the air grow colder still. Whatever revelations Holmes had gleaned from the slip, he alone would carry them, for now. And so we remained, trapped in the dim glow of Baker Street, with 11 living souls, 1 corpse, and a phantom guest whose presence seemed closer with every passing moment. Holmes had remained silent through the uproar of poison and accusation, his stillness more unnerving than the chaos itself. Yet now he stepped forward, his eyes like cold steel, and I felt the entire room stiffen beneath his gaze. "You sit among strangers," he said, his voice low but charged with authority. "But every word you utter, every gesture you make, betrays more than you intend. Let us strip away the masks, one by one." He moved as a hawk might circle its prey, directing his gaze first upon a thin, scholarly gentleman, whose fingers shook with every attempt at composure. A single question, deceptively mild, drew forth a stumble, a contradiction, then silence. The man's lips pressed tight as though he dared not speak further. Next, Holmes turned his eyes upon the widow. "You declared yourself a stranger to all here," he murmured, "yet your veil shifted when one name was spoken, and your pulse leapt in your throat. Do not think such signs escape me." The widow drew back with a gasp. The merchant muttered something inaudible. The air grew thick, oppressive, as though judgment itself had entered the room. Holmes pressed on, his tone sharp as a blade. "Confession is unnecessary. Your faces speak for you. I see guilt in some, fear in others, and desperation in more than one. Understand this. Lies will not save you. Every secret concealed here will be dragged into the light before this night is done." The guests shrank beneath his words. I confess, even I felt the weight of his scrutiny, as though my very soul lay bare before him. The silence that followed was broken not by Holmes, but by a sudden slip between 2 of the guests. A gentleman of modest dress leaned too near a pale young woman at his side, his hand brushing hers in a gesture meant for comfort. It lasted only a heartbeat, but in that instant, their intimacy betrayed them utterly. Holmes's eyes flickered, sharp and merciless. "Ah," he said, his tone almost sardonic, "the union of fear and secrecy makes for strong bonds. Lovers, are you not? Yet your silence has spoken more eloquently than words." The pair flushed crimson, the man stammering denials while the woman bit her lip until it bled. Their shame was palpable, and though their guilt might not extend to murder, the discovery of their secret lent the room an air of tightening dread. For if they could hide this, what greater concealments might yet lie in their hearts? I felt pity, yet also a gnawing unease. Their intimacy hinted at entanglements that might reach further into the mystery than we yet imagined. Holmes, however, gave them no reprieve. His expression remained unreadable, his deductions relentless, his voice carrying like a gavel striking the bench of some spectral court. Holmes turned next to the officer, a broad-shouldered man whose bearing, though proud, was marred by a certain stiffness. From the moment of his arrival, there had been in him an air of bitterness, as though he bore a wound deeper than flesh. "You carry yourself as a soldier," Holmes observed, "but not one in honourable standing. Your uniform is gone, your commission lost. Shall I tell them why?" The officer's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the arm of his chair. Holmes's words fell like hammer blows. "You were cashiered from your regiment for cowardice under fire. You covered the truth with tales of ill health. Yet I see the tremor in your hand that is no malady of the body, but of the conscience. You are a man disgraced, living in the shadow of dishonour." A murmur rippled through the company. The officer sprang to his feet, his face dark with rage. "By God, sir, you go too far." Holmes did not flinch. His voice was icy calm. "Sit down, or I shall tell them more. The debts you contracted, the fraudulent papers signed in another's name. Do not think your shame concealed. The walls of Baker Street have no ears, but I do." The officer sank back, his fury smouldering, his pride broken. The silence that followed was heavy, with the knowledge that another mask had been torn away. I confess, I felt a chill creep along my spine. Each revelation drew us deeper into a labyrinth where honor, loyalty, and truth seemed as fragile as glass. And still, the phantom guest lingered unseen, as though mocking the exposures with his absence. Holmes's eye fell next upon the man, whose words had from the beginning dripped with a too oily charm. He was a fellow of smooth tongue and ready smile, eager to interject whenever silence grew oppressive, as though hoping to sway suspicion by sheer force of geniality. "Your confidence is admirable," Holmes said coolly, "but entirely misplaced, for you speak not in your own name, but in another's, and have carried that mask so long you believe it your own face." The man gave a nervous laugh, but it died in his throat when Holmes produced a crumpled slip of paper he had withdrawn earlier from the poisoned victim's sleeve. Though the writing was lost to flame, Holmes now revealed the header of the letter, still preserved in his memory. "You are not the man you pretend to be. The handwriting of your false receipts matches the loops upon that note. You pass under borrowed names, swindling honest men until ruin drives them to despair." The fraudster paled, then blustered with denials, but the company recoiled from him as though contagion clung to his garments. His mask of civility had slipped, revealing a hollow core of deceit. Holmes's voice was sharp as a lash. "Fraud alone does not make you a murderer, but it makes your word worth less than ash. Sit down, sir, and be silent." And the man obeyed, his head bowed, his former arrogance scattered like smoke before the wind. Holmes now turned his gaze back to the body that lay lifeless upon the carpet. With deliberate care, he produced from his pocket the list of names sent by the mysterious benefactor, the 12 whom fate had gathered at Baker Street. "Here," he said, "are the guests who were summoned. And here," he gestured to the corpse, "lies one who was never meant to sit among you." A gasp ran through the assembly. I leaned forward, scarcely crediting my ears. "You mean," I stammered, "this man, this poor fellow, was not one of the 12? Holmes's eyes glittered. "Precisely. His name is absent from the list. Whoever he was, he entered this house under false pretenses. The question is, did he do so as a victim or as an accomplice in a larger design?" The widow clutched her veil more tightly about her face. The officer muttered an oath. The merchant crossed himself with trembling fingers. None dared meet the other's eyes. The revelation cast us deeper into uncertainty than before. We had thought the mystery confined to discovering the guilty among us. Now we faced the ghastly truth that even the corpse itself was an enigma. The phantom guest who had not yet revealed himself was joined by another phantom, the dead man who should never have been present at all. My heart chilled at the thought. Baker Street had become a stage where even the roles of victim and villain could not be trusted. The company sat in stricken silence, their faces pale in the wavering firelight. Holmes stood tall, his features grave, his voice carrying the weight of doom. "You must now understand," he said slowly, "that this gathering is no accident. It is a design, intricate, deliberate, and deadly. The phantom guest remains among us, cloaked in shadow. The corpse upon the floor is but one thread in a tapestry of deception. And the hand that poured the poison still trembles in this room." A shudder ran through the assembly. I felt the hair rise upon my neck. Holmes's gaze swept from face to face, his words falling like hammer blows. "Do not comfort yourselves with the thought that the danger has passed. On the contrary, it has only begun. Mark me well, the killer has struck once and will strike again. Before dawn breaks, another life may be claimed." The widow gave a faint cry and covered her face. The officer clenched his fists, though his eyes betrayed fear. The fraudster groaned and muttered prayers beneath his breath. I could scarcely breathe. The thought of being trapped within, these familiar walls, each hour a ticking threat, each guest a potential executioner. It pressed upon my heart with dreadful force. Holmes, however, remained unflinching. "I shall unmask the truth," he said, his voice cold as iron. "But until then, none shall leave this room. You will remain seated, watched, measured, and judged. For before the night ends, the guilty hand will betray itself, and when it does, I shall be ready." He fell silent. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire, the ticking of the clock, and the heavy collective breath of 12 souls bound together by terror, though one among them was death itself. It was in the midst of that dreadful hush, when Holmes's warning still reverberated in our ears, that I noticed a subtle change in the company. The seats, once so tightly occupied, bore a gap. I counted quickly, my heart thudding. 10 faces stared back at me. One, only one, was missing. Holmes saw it too. His expression hardened, though he gave no sign of alarm. "So," he murmured, "the game advances." A hurried search of the room revealed nothing. No open window, no disturbed lock. It was as though the missing guest had melted into the walls themselves. Yet one object remained, a single glove, stained dark with blood, lying upon the carpet by the door. The widow shrieked and shrank back, whispering of ghosts. The officer swore under his breath. For myself, I could scarcely quell the chill rising through my veins. One vanished, leaving only that dreadful token. Was it the mark of the killer, or of the next victim? Holmes picked up the glove delicately. His keen eyes lingered upon the stains. "The night grows shorter," he said softly, "yet our mystery deepens." As the company stirred in frightened whispers, Holmes beckoned me aside. His voice, though low, carried an urgency that sent a tremor through me. "Watson, we no longer contend with an isolated crime. Do you not see it? The gathering, the poisoned glass, the vanishing guest, these are but parts of a larger design. Every soul in this room is bound by a single chain." I looked at him in bewilderment. But to what end? What chain can draw together such strangers? Holmes's gaze was fierce. "Finance, my dear fellow, the lifeblood of modern villainy. Each of these 12 names," he tapped the folded list in his breast pocket, "is entangled in a web of debts, investments, and fraud. The benefactor who summoned them knew this. He contrived to draw them here that the truth might be unveiled, or that vengeance might be executed." I felt a heaviness settle upon me. If Holmes spoke true, then this was no mere parlour crime, but a conspiracy vast enough to ruin lives and fortunes alike. And somewhere at the heart of it, hidden, patient, merciless, lurked the phantom guest who orchestrated the night. Holmes' hand gripped my shoulder. "Remember this, Watson. Greed binds men tighter than honour, and looser than fear. Tonight, we shall see which proves stronger." Holmes returned to the assembly with the cold authority of a judge passing sentence. Drawing forth a sheaf of notes, scraps of letters, and the remnants of ledgers seized during his earlier examinations, he began to weave a narrative so damning that I felt my blood chill as I listened. "You, merchant, your debts exceed your fortune by half. You sought relief from this clerk, whose false accounts deepened your ruin. And you, officer, your disgrace was sealed when you signed away another's bonds for your own survival. The fraudster at your side forged the signatures, the scholar covered it with his pen. Even the widow here, yes, madam, was not innocent, for she endorsed the documents that bound you all together." A murmur of horror filled the room. Denials rose, then faltered, for each knew that Holmes spoke truth. Their eyes turned inward, each recalling the moment they had yielded to temptation, to secrecy, to sin. Holmes's voice was inexorable. "Thus we arrive at the circle of 12, a ring of accomplices, knowingly or unknowingly complicit in a financial conspiracy that has now become a stage for murder. The question remains, who among you seeks not silence but blood?" The words fell like a knell. Even I, who had stood by Holmes in darker places than these, felt an icy dread settle upon me. For though he spoke with certainty, the guilty hand remained unseen, and the night stretched long before us still. Holmes had been silent for some minutes, his head bowed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The company sat in uneasy stillness, every eye fixed upon him, waiting for the next blow to fall. At last he stirred, his voice low and deliberate. "You have hidden much this night," he said, "but guilt is a restless guest. It shifts, it stirs, it betrays itself when pressed." He moved to the center of the room and with calm authority directed the company to change their places. "You, madam, sit nearer the window, you, sir, beside the fire, and you, merchant, take the vacant seat near the door." The guests obeyed, bewildered, muttering protests under their breath. Yet Holmes's tone allowed no refusal. I could not fathom his design, but I had seen such maneuvers before. How he would disturb the waters only to watch which fish rose to the surface. When they were arranged, Holmes folded his arms and let his gaze sweep across the circle. "Now," he murmured, "let us see who wears their mask most tightly. For when I reveal the next truth, one among you shall not endure it." He spoke no further. He simply let the silence hang, heavy as iron, until it pressed upon the lungs like a weight. I saw eyes flicker, hands tremble, beads of sweat gather at brows. The tension grew unbearable until it seemed some hidden string must snap. And then, snap it did. From the farthest corner of the room, where shadow and smoke mingled thickest, there came the faintest rustle, a movement so slight it might have been dismissed as the shifting of drapery. But Holmes was already upon it. With the swiftness of a striking hawk, he turned, his voice ringing out, "Enough! Step forward, sir. The masquerade is ended." The company gasped. Out of the darkness a figure emerged, tall, gaunt, his features sharp and spectral in the firelight. It was the missing 12th, silent, watchful, dreadful in his composure. I confess my heart leapt as though I beheld an apparition. For hours we had spoken of him as phantom, spectre, unseen presence, and now here he stood in flesh and blood. His eyes glowed with a cold fire, and his lips curved in a smile that chilled me to the marrow. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes," he said softly. "Clever enough to know I was here all along. But tell me, did you know why?" Holmes regarded him with unflinching calm. "I knew from the first moment the coats were counted. You entered this house with the others, yet sat not among them. You watched, concealed, waiting for panic to ripen. You are not guest, nor victim, but judge and executioner." A murmur of horror passed through the assembly. The widow fainted back into her chair. The officer clutched the armrest as though bracing for a blow. The phantom guest inclined his head, almost in mockery. "Perhaps," he said, "but I am more than that. I am the betrayed, the ruined, the forgotten. Each of these fine souls before you has dipped his hand in the same trough of greed. I merely came to remind them that debts must be paid." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You came to kill." The man spread his arms as if in benediction. "To balance the scales." The company recoiled as one. I felt the chill of something vast and terrible pressing upon us all. For here, at last, was the architect of our nightmare, the 12th guest, no longer phantom, but avenger, his presence as dreadful as the silence that followed. And Holmes, standing rigid as steel, gave no sign of fear, only the quiet certainty that this battle of minds had only just begun. Holmes stood before the company like a magistrate pronouncing sentence. His voice was calm, yet each word seemed to echo with inexorable force. "You believe yourselves the victims of accident, but nothing of this night was chance. It was contrived, every detail, every silence, every misstep, by one who knew your secrets better than you knew them yourselves." The phantom guest, still half in shadow, gave the faintest smile. Holmes ignored him. "From the moment the letters were dispatched, you were summoned not to safety, but to judgment. The poisoned glass was no random stroke. It was bait, a demonstration of power. The disappearance of one among you was no escape, but design meant to deepen suspicion. And the corpse upon the floor, he pointed to the lifeless form, was not victim, but decoy, planted to confuse the reckoning. A murmur of horror rose, but Holmes pressed on, his tone sharpening. Each of you sought to bury your guilt in silence. Each of you thought your part too small to be exposed. But the phantom guest gathered you here to prove the opposite, that none can escape the chain of fraud, deceit, and greed. And I, gentlemen, have traced every link of that chain. He produced scraps of letters, fragments of accounts, even the broken watch whose filed initials betrayed its owner. The hand that orchestrated this web left traces, hidden, yes, but not invisible. And now the pattern is plain. The room grew still. Every eye was fixed on Holmes. And though I had seen him perform miracles of deduction before, never had I felt the atmosphere so heavy with dread, as though judgment itself hovered in the smoke-thickened air. Holmes' gaze swept the company, his voice deepening into something almost solemn. 12, an ancient number of reckoning. 12 jurors to weigh guilt. 12 disciples to bear witness. 12 guests summoned here tonight. Do you not see? This gathering was more than a meeting. It was a tribunal. The widow gasped, clutching at her veil. The officer's lips pressed thin, as though he tasted gall. Even the fraudster bowed his head, no longer able to maintain his pretense of bravado. Holmes continued. Each of you sat in judgment of the others, though none dared admit it. You were called not merely as conspirators, but as accomplices to one crime greater than the theft of coin, the betrayal of trust. Your circle of 12 was meant to serve as its own jury, yet within that circle, the phantom guest alone claimed the role of executioner. He allowed the words to sink in, his eyes glittering in the firelight. This is no random assembly. It is the enactment of vengeance cloaked in symbolism. You have sat here tonight not as strangers, but as figures in a grim pageant. And one among you, he gestured toward the shadowed guest, has wielded that symbolism like a dagger. The silence that followed was suffocating. The number 12 no longer seemed a mere accident of invitations, but a circle drawn in blood, binding each soul to judgment. Holmes's voice softened, though it carried still the weight of doom. The motive is not greed alone, nor the petty fraud of signatures and false ledgers. It is older, deeper, more bitter. Betrayal. He turned toward the phantom guest. Years ago, you trusted these men and women. You placed your fortune, your honor, perhaps even your heart, in their hands. And what did they return? Deceit. They ruined you, casting you into the shadows while they prospered in silence. The man's eyes gleamed with a terrible fire. Yes, he whispered. They feasted while I starved. They laughed while I fell. But tonight, they sit where I command them. Tonight, they pay. Holmes's face betrayed no pity. You have sought vengeance, not justice. You brought them here not to confess, but to tremble. Yet vengeance, too, leaves its trace. You revealed yourself not by what you destroyed, but by what you preserved. You wanted them alive long enough to suffer, to fear the dawn. That is why you left the corpse as decoy, why you let poison strike only once. Your own desire betrayed you. The phantom guest's lips parted, but no denial came. The truth, at last, lay bare. I felt my heart constrict. To see vengeance carried out in such dreadful symmetry chilled me more deeply than any blade. For here was not merely a crime, but a reckoning long buried, now risen like a ghost to claim its due. And Holmes, though victorious in unmasking it, seemed himself haunted, as though the shadow of that betrayal had touched even him. Holmes's figure loomed in the firelight, tall and spectral, his voice cutting through the silence with the chill of a blade. Enough concealment. The time for riddles has ended. You stand, sir, revealed, not merely as one wronged, but as the very hand that has guided this night into blood and terror. All eyes turned upon the phantom guest. He stood motionless, yet his lips curved faintly, as though he had awaited the moment of exposure. Holmes continued, relentless. You summoned them here under the guise of a benefactor. You counted on their shame, their hidden debts, their guilty consciences, to weaken them before your gaze. The poisoned glass was your strike, meant not merely to kill, but to sow dread. The vanished glove, the false corpse, each one a stage piece in your theatre of vengeance. And you, sir, the architect, remained in shadow, manipulating fear as another man might shuffle cards. The merchant rose half out of his chair, his face ashen. The widow moaned faintly. The disgraced officer swore beneath his breath. Each knew, even before Holmes spoke the name, that the net had closed. Holmes's eyes blazed. You are no phantom. You are a man betrayed by those you once trusted, ruined by their conspiracy of fraud and silence. You might have sought redress through law, but you chose instead to be judge, jury, and would-be executioner, and in that choice lies your damnation. The guest gave a strangled laugh, harsh and broken. They left me to rot, he said. Now they know what it is to tremble. Holmes's voice was like iron. Your vengeance is complete, but justice is not yours to wield. The law will have you now. The man's shoulders sagged. His triumph crumbled, leaving only the gaunt shadow of bitterness long endured. And in that instant, the company knew their terror had not been born of spectres, but of one man's ruthless design. The company sat in silence, pale as statues, while Holmes's words lingered in the smoke-filled air. The fire guttered low, casting the room in a red gloom that seemed more fitting to a courtroom than to a parlour. I looked about me then and felt the strangeness of it all. 12 seats, 12 figures, yet the illusion of equality had long been shattered. They were not guests but jurors, each one weighed by Holmes, scrutiny, each one judged not by law, but by conscience and by fear. And in the midst of them sat the true arbiter, not the man who sought vengeance, nor the corpse upon the floor, but Holmes himself. His deductions had stripped away every mask, torn open every hidden shame, and laid bare the secret web that bound them. It was as though Baker Street itself had transformed into a stage of judgment, with Holmes presiding as the lone authority, and we, his unwilling congregation, forced to witness the reckoning. The widow sobbed softly. The officer stared into the fire as if seeking redemption in its embers. The fraudster bowed his head, broken. Each of them bore the look not merely of suspects, but of souls condemned by their own knowledge of guilt. I confess I too was shaken, for though Holmes had triumphed, the air seemed heavy still, as though some echo of the phantom guest lingered in the walls. I thought of the number 12, the jurors in their box, the apostles at their table, the conspirators in their circle, and shuddered at its grim symmetry. Holmes, however, betrayed no such unease. He turned to me, his expression grave but composed. "Watson," he said quietly, "tonight we have witnessed not murder alone, but the peril of vengeance clothed in righteousness. Remember well, when men set themselves as instruments of justice, they become no better than those they condemn." I bowed my head, unable to answer. For in that moment, I knew that Baker Street would never feel the same to me again. Its familiar walls had echoed with the cries of terror. Its hearth had burned with the ashes of deceit, and its floor had borne the weight of 12 souls summoned to judgment. And though the dawn would come, bringing with it the ordinary bustle of London streets, I felt certain that the shadows of this night would never entirely depart. Holmes stood by the dying fire, his silhouette dark against the glow. His eyes were distant, yet his words carried the weight of finality. "Vengeance, Watson," he said softly, "is but justice distorted by passion. Those who cloak themselves as judges often become worse offenders than the guilty they pursue. The true lesson is this: when truth is forced into silence, it always finds a voice, though often in dreadful form. And now I turn to you. In your judgment, what was the mastermind's gravest error? His crime, or the belief that he could control fear itself? Share your thoughts below, and if this tale has stirred your mind, do comment, subscribe, and share it with others who relish a mystery worth pondering. The game, after all, continues.